Hey, Hakase here. Do you feel at a loss for how to accumulate the right subset of information about Path of Exile as it seems scattered randomly across the internet? This is exactly how I felt when I started Path of Exile 2 knowing next to nothing about the game. And now, almost 450 hours of game time later, I'm starting to finally feel a bit like efficient water. So here are 11 of the most useful things I've learned so far. The game is way simpler than its predecessor, but it still has a ton of depth. Thankfully, the game has a lot of information built in, and almost anything you may want to know about the game's mechanics is directly accessible in the game. The way to access this information is by holding the Alt key and then mousing over any underlined bits of text to get more information. You can also click on the underlined words to create a persistent tooltip window for the information. The next tip is all about efficiency. You almost never have to drag things in this game. Just hold Control to quickly buy and sell items and move things between your stash and inventory. You can also use Control when interacting with frequent NPCs. For example, holding it on the disenchant vendor will go straight to the disenchanting window, and holding it when interacting with the hooded one will directly identify all your items without needing to go through dialogue options. Tip number 3 is a follow-up for quicker inventory management. You can actually assign stash tabs to have affinities. What does this mean? Well, say you want all your unique items to go into a specific tab. You can go to that tab, set its affinity to unique, and now, anytime you deposit unique items, they will go straight into that tab, even if you're currently on a different tab. Okay, so this next tip is one that gets mentioned a lot, but it really is extremely important. You've got to check vendors for upgrades. Vendor item stocks refresh every time you level up, and they can have an upgrade ready for your character or one of your other existing or future characters. And make sure to check for promising magic items too. There could be an item that has strong potential for being upgraded. You probably won't find something every level or maybe even every several levels, but you're very likely to find at least a few great items on every campaign playthrough. I actually check the vendors of the act I'm currently in and sometimes previous acts too, as even items meant for lower levels can be very powerful with the right stats. Speaking of vendors, the items they stock can also have quality or sockets on them. You can search for these every time you level up, buy them and salvage them for upgrade materials. This is especially profitable from the Act 1 vendors as their items are so cheap. So make sure you also do this early on any new characters to make use of low vendor prices. When it comes to searching vendors, you can use the search function just like in most software by pressing Ctrl coupled with the F key and typing parameter names. My personal go-tos for searching are skill for items with plus to skill gem levels, qual for items with quality to salvage, movement for boots with movement speed, and rare to quickly glance over the rare items that the vendor has in stock. You can also search other parts of the UI, like your stash and passive tree. While on the topic of vendors, I gotta talk a bit about the gambling vendor. It is another important asset in the game for getting items, and this is what you should really consider spending your excess gold on. As long as you have enough gold to buy items from the other vendors if a really powerful one appears, you should consider gambling to fill out slots where you have weaker items. In the campaign, you will have limited gambling vendor charges, which are replenished by killing rare and unique enemies. Keep in mind that you can get unique items from the gambling vendor, and I have a video about how you can farm some powerful uniques using the gambling vendor, which is super useful on solo self-found. Find it linked in the corner. Okay, so the next few tips are about stats, and you've probably heard it before, but movement speed is an insanely important stat. Moving faster means you clear faster, which increases the rate of your progress, but also boosts your survivability massively by making it easier to dodge mechanics and enabling you to outmaneuver enemies. It's so important that you quickly start to disregard any boots that don't have movement speed on them, regardless of how good the other stats are. One quick note here that's not so obvious in the game is that armor actually reduces your movement speed. Resistances are another thing I kept hearing was really important when I started out, but I had a hard time understanding exactly how important they are and how much of them I should have. In hardcore leagues, I would highly recommend to get every bit of resistance you can up to cap, prioritizing it over damage, including chaos resistance. In terms of resistance levels versus your progression through the game, I would say aim to have at least 40% cold res before you fight Count Geonor, which is the last boss of Act 1, along with at least some fire and lightning resistance. Aim to have at least 60% lightning resistance and at least 40% cold and fire res towards the end of Act 2. And aim to have 65 to 70% plus in all elemental resistances towards the end of Act 3, and look at getting at least a little bit of chaos res at this point. When progressing cruel difficulty, try to keep your elemental resistances over 70% and slowly accumulating chaos res into the endgame. Of course, there are people who finish with way lower resistance values, especially in softcore, and I salute you. but I prefer to be safer because I get hit by a lot of mechanics and also play hardcore, so survival is key for me. On softcore, you can probably get away with less than res cap in the campaign, but in late game, dying is punishing, so I'd highly recommend getting res capped when you start mapping. Keep in mind also that you lose 10% resistances when you enter every new act, and also when you enter endgame. And completing parts of the campaign will give you a total plus 20 to all elemental resistances and a potential plus 10 to chaos resistance. And on the topic of resistances, most bosses have a main elemental damage type. It is very useful to know this for every boss and equip some items that increase your resistances to that type of elemental damage when you're about to go and fight the boss if you don't have all of your resistances capped and have items available to help you achieve that. For example, I promise you will struggle a lot less against Count Geonor if you get at least 40% cold res. That is, if you struggle against him and you're not just an absolute pro. Some bosses will do mainly chaos damage or physical damage, and you gotta be especially careful on those, as those damage types are not easy to mitigate, so these bosses will generally require better dodge skills. So I have one last tip here for you, and that is to do with stat requirements. I remember when I was just starting out, the main stats like strength, intelligence, and dexterity seemed pretty useless to me, but later on, you can come across stat requirement walls, especially for some builds. A good example of this is minion builds, so make sure to keep items, especially jewelry, with these stats on them in case you need it later on to meet a stat requirement threshold. There are also items that have a stat requirement, but at the same time they give you that stat. So with the item equipped, you meet the stat requirement, but you cannot equip the item in the first place because you don't meet the stat requirement without having it equipped. In this case, another item that gives that stat can be used temporarily just to equip that item, and then that intermediary item can be removed. To be honest, I think this should be changed so that you can just directly equip items where the stat requirement will be fulfilled by equipping the item. This is like super janky and annoying as hell. And that's pretty much it. I believe with these tips, you should have a much smoother introduction to the game, and all of these are actually applicable at every level of progression. However, there are some less intuitive things about the game, some of which are not so obvious, and you could play the game a long time without finding out about them. Like, what the hell is luck? Does armor actually work? How the f does crit chance work? Check out my next video where I cover the answers to these questions and more. See you there.